Welcome to the Borders and Globalization Research Program podcast. I speak from the territory of the Indigenous Peoples in the Salish Sea region. Today, we are pleased to welcome Brian Thom, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Victoria, BC, Canada. His areas of expertise are notably cultural anthropology, indigenous legal orders, and land rights. His research focuses on the political, social, and cultural processes that surround Indigenous peoples' efforts to resolve Aboriginal title and rights claim and establish self-government. His written work explores the interplay of culture, power, and colonial discourses in land claims negotiations and examines the political and ontological challenges for Indigenous people engaged with institutions of the state. Brian Thom wrote several articles about Indigenous legal orders, Indigenous territories, overlapping claims, and paradox of boundaries in Coast Salish territories, etc. Our interview today will therefore focus on the territoriality and cultural networks of Indigenous peoples through the anthropological lens. Welcome, Mr. Brian Thom. Thank you for accepting our invitation for this interview.
No, thank you, Benjamin. It's a delight to be here. Such an auspicious place, Center for Global Studies.
Yes. I will quickly recall the context of our discussion today. When we look at political maps, we see that the world is a precise grid with lines that delimit the territories of the states. It is in fact a legal architecture made by the modern states that dominates the world and its intellectual and political representations. But Indigenous peoples have their own political, legal, and cultural systems. They have their own territories. As we know, First Nations people have lived all across Canada for thousands of years. They managed their lands and resources with their own government, laws, and traditions. Today, we are going to explore this complexity and see how these different frameworks of thought and action relate to the models of modern states. Mr. Thom, let's start with a question about your research, if you don't mind. Can you give us a little more detail about your academic profile? Why cultural anthropology, and what are your main research about?
Okay, thank you. Yes. I have been a professor here in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Victoria since 2010. And prior to coming to UVic, I worked for 14 years in the BC treaty process as a negotiator, advisor, and researcher for several First Nations communities on Vancouver Island and in the BC Lower Mainland. Prior to that, I had worked as a graduate student, as an archaeologist. I had worked in a museum and had lots of, exposure to these sort of issues around why land is important to Indigenous communities, doing mapping work, doing groundwork with the communities to set the mandates for what would happen in the negotiations. So bringing an anthropological approach to informing those talks. And I think that experience very much shaped my direction as an academic at the university. I think the research questions that come out of Indigenous communities engaging with questions of having their rights and title and governance negotiated and recognized, and the interweaving of those with state legal orders and political orders raise a number of complicated problems, not the least of which is the map and the question of what will this look like as we chart it out on a map, and how those things are set in stone through mainstream political and legal processes. Talking with elders and doing work on the ground, you realize that it's actually quite complex. and that having a strong foundation of cultural knowledge is really important to inform what we're saying when we're having these discussions about territoriality and those relationships with land and why it's important and what motivates it. So I think that those have been my overarching goals in the research, is to produce some sort of anthropological work that pulls at those kinds of cultural questions and that kind of deeper cultural understandings set here on Vancouver Island for the most part, but also in other Indigenous communities. Thinking about how our representations as partners with Indigenous peoples about their territories can become powerful in these legal and political dynamics. What are the challenges of those representations in those processes? How they get read, as it were.
Okay.
And yeah, I think that's there's a lot of other kind of philosophical questions that come up. These kinds of questions of ontology, these kinds of questions about what is in the world, and how do we connect our relationships with territory and law through these sort of fundamental experiences of what we think the world is and how we experience that world. Yeah, so those are some of my interests.
Thank you, Mr. Thom, for this biography and these details about your work. My second question, Brian, concerns directly the anthropological lens. What is the use of anthropology in matters of First Nation territoriality? Why anthropology is important?
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting question. I think anthropologists have been invited to this conversation by Indigenous communities for a long time. In the British Columbia context, since the 1960s, and the work of Wilson Duff, the anthropologist Wilson Duff, on the White and Bob case, the first modern day case that recognized the Douglas treaties on Vancouver Island. And Duff's later work in the Calder case that the Nisga'a brought forward in the 1970s, decision by the Supreme Court of Canada. And here, the anthropological work was requested by the nation and by the courts to help bridge the cultures, to help translate the kind of Indigenous cultural systems and practices to something that's recognizable in a legal context. And I think that those kinds of anthropological excursions, I suppose, from a deep partnership and relationship with Indigenous peoples, and thinking about the culture as it's practiced and understood on the ground, and explaining those things in a forum that has this kind of political and legal weight, has gone on since those times. There have been a lot of anthropological work done to help document the sites and practices of Indigenous peoples and their territoriality, that in that conversation has given rise to a number of tests that the Supreme Court of Canada has articulated that Indigenous peoples need to demonstrate in order to have their title and rights recognized. So we often get called by Indigenous communities to say, okay, we need to demonstrate our land use and occupancy. We know this is our territory, but we have to prove it. And so come and use your anthropological methods to help document those things through interviews and participant observation and oral history work, cartography, ethnography, and its sort of classic forms in many ways, to demonstrate our the reality of our lived experience, but also the social systems and cultural systems that ground that are the basis of Indigenous law and Indigenous governance, that those practices are built on, and help us explain those in these legal and political processes as well. So I think anthropology is well equipped as a discipline, methodologically in particular. This kind of commitment to long-term engagement with the community, to practice a kind of ethnography that is deeply rooted in relationships and understanding. It's not just a survey that comes in like a sociological survey that comes in with 100 questions and then you leave and you're never back again. I think getting at the roots of these kinds of cultural matters requires that ethnographic approach. So anthropology is well situated to that.
Perfect link for my next question. Thank you, Brian. In this field of anthropology, a technique is used which is called ethnographic mapping. Could you tell us a little bit more about this technique of ethnographic mapping and for what purposes this technique could be used for?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. At the University of Victoria here in 2010, I founded our ethnographic mapping lab. People who are interested can check out the website at ethnographicmapping.uvic.ca. And the ethnographic mapping has long roots in anthropology and actually quite problematic roots. There's an interesting story told by the historian of anthropology, Regan Darnell, about some of the very early maps that were made by the Bureau of American Ethnology, where the U.S. government was asking its ethnographers to go out west and make maps of similar tribal political systems, nations that spoke similar languages and related languages, to help facilitate the U.S. government's removal of those people off of their lands and onto reservations. And so they didn't want to have people with very different cultural and linguistic systems on the same reservations. So they created these early ethnographic maps as a way to facilitate taking people off their lands and putting them on reservations. So we have this long problematic history of this making these kinds of maps that end up looking very much like a map of European states, these kinds of contiguous, bounded, neatly delineated groups of languages or groups of cultures, as they used to be described as kind of a frozen thing, and those maps, they found themselves into the first pages of every ethnography, of every kind of indigenous textbook and encyclopedia or museum exhibit for decades. And fast forward, I think the kind of ethnographic practice as it deepened over the decades in the 20th century and perhaps in more, particularly in the last 50 years, there become an interest in the idea of place and the indigenous relations to particular places. And so ethnographic mapping has taken on a course of attaching stories and understandings and knowledge to particular places, often through the icon of a name or of a particular landmark, a kind of cultural geography set in a kind of ethnographic methodology where we're having these long-term conversations with people to sort of thicken out our ideas of these cultural geographies. So I think contemporary today, as it's practiced, ethnographic mapping is much less about these kinds of creating simplistic maps of tribal boundaries and more about having these kind of long-term dialogues about their relations to place and plotting them out on a map or in a mapping system, in a kind of database system that gives rise to the stories and the connections and the rootedness and the complexities of those attachments to land.
Very interesting, Brian. Thank you for this answer about this specific method. If we come back to a more general question now, we know that the territory of the modern state is defined by political power over a population within special limits that are the borders. And you spoke about this creation of the contiguity. The territory of the state is the location where their so-called territorial sovereignty is exercised. I know that the question is complex, but from your point of view as an anthropologist, we know that since the arrival of European laws and practices, the significance of land to First Nation in BC has not diminished. What can you tell us about the type of relationship of Indigenous people with the land and space? And you spoke about this concept and this notion of place. What is the First Nation relationship to the land? In other words, what is the significance of land for the First Nations and Indigenous peoples?
It's a wonderful question, and I think it's the question that underlies a lot of the motivations in Indigenous communities for having these political and legal rights recognized, because that relationship to place is so foundational. The relation between land and culture in Indigenous communities is just a very, very important groundwork for all of the other elements of society, whether it's this sort of spiritual practice and sustenance and understandings of relationship of kin and the teachings that come from those connections to places and the other beings that live in those places are really essential. These are in Indigenous communities. So I would say that, of course, every nation, every different area across North America would have a different particularity in terms of their answer about
Yes.
this connection to place.
Yes,
And I would hate to paint things in too broad of strokes. But so in my experience in Coast Salish communities, I've heard a lot about why is land important? Why is it that it's worth, having these long sustained 100+ year long engagements with the states to have their place, in their lands, in their territories recognized. And I think that it's hard to boil down to even a small cluster of things, but I would say that those relations to land go to a kind of ancestry, in an Indigenous sense. So let's take an example. For instance, let's take ourselves to the territories of the Cowichan people in the Cowichan Valley here on Vancouver Island. They're overlooked. If you're in the Cowichan Valley and you look to the north, you can't help but see the mountain Suk-As, Mount Prevost. It's a famous landmark in Cowichan history, being the first place that a human fell from the sky at the beginning of time.
Yeah.
This man and his dog fell. They landed. The man with his teachings and his tools and his prerogatives, and he and his dog surveyed the valley below and saw many monsters who were living there, these Tlalakun. And the dog and the man went down from the mountain and killed a number of them and made the world safer for other first people to fall from the sky. These other individuals, all of whom have names, who are remembered in the communities today, and in fact whose names are have an ancestry and are passed on as inherited names through the generations. And so people living in those families in the Cowichan Valley, there are people who are connected to the named individuals that were there at the beginning of time. But it's not only these kinds of legendary individuals who came and did amazing things and whose lineages trace right to today.
Yes.
But also even the people who encountered the transformer Chels. So Chels is a famous cultural figure in Coast Salish oral narratives. He is the transformer. He is the creator. Some people have called him Little Jesus in English. He was a very important person who came along after the very first ancestors, but made the world a lot of what it is today. He encountered different people, and he transformed some of them. Some were transformed into deer, some to salmon, some to stone. And those people weren't just random people, kind of anonymous characters. Those were named people whose families are known. So that, on the Nanaimo River, Chief Doug White has talked about the story of the transformation that happened of one of the ancestors of the Snuneymuxw community near Jack Point, and into the salmon. And so the people at Snuneymuxw are literally related to the salmon that come up the river at Jack Point. So these kinds of connections are not nostalgic in a kind of sense.
Yeah.
They're familial.
Yeah.
And I think those are the sort of, beginnings of the underpinnings of why land is important.
Wow. Yeah.
It grounds who you are as a person. It grounds who you are as a network of families, as a community, to be attached to those places, to be able to go to those places and experience those places. And these communities have been here for 10,000 years, right? They haven't gone anywhere. They haven't traveled around, with great diasporas as the European countries have, right? I mean, these are communities that have really been here since anybody has ever lived here. And so that kind of, I think, very long connection is another dynamic. Not to say that these communities don't have a history and that the sort of political lives and haven't changed over those vast long periods of times, and economic lives and social lives. Of course they have, but yet they persist. And so that's like the identity kind of relationship of why land is important. And then we have all the other things that we can imagine, like the economic kind of connections that come from, say, a Coast Salish economy. These are Coast Salish people are wealthy people living in their territories when they have their rights to the salmon, the shellfish, the deer, the camas, all of these things recognized, functioning in their economies of wealth, of giving, of potlatching, right? The land is the basis of their sustenance, of their well-being, and their livelihoods, their wealth, and so those kind of economic relations are really, really important as well.
Thank you, Brian, for this amazing stories about this long and deep connection between First Nation, Indigenous people, and the land. Always in connection with this notion of territory or territoriality or spatiality. What are the characteristics of Indigenous territories or Indigenous territorialities? Do you have some interesting examples?
Yeah, the issue of territoriality is one that's been debated actually in anthropology for decades. We can, I remember as a doctoral student reading the debates set in the James Bay Cree region about Algonquin hunting territories, and people asking, well, do Indigenous peoples have territories that have a kind of property sense to them or jurisdictional sense to them, or are they more like a range, like an animal has a range, but it's not really a territory? And I think, it's clear that Indigenous peoples have territories. They have areas on which their laws apply, which their societies govern, which their sovereignties are a reality. And that these aren't boundless, limitless places, like they don't just, Coast Salish territories don't include Baffin Island, for instance, in the Canadian Arctic. I mean, it's that, so there is a sense of a sort of a geographic flavor to territories. And I think that in the work that's been done in various communities, I remember in the Delgamuukw case in the 80s as it was being tried, and then in the 90s as the court decisions were coming, the leadership from the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en communities made very strategic maps, very careful maps showing tribal boundaries and boundaries of each house and where those apply to, in a kind of familiar looking map that neatly parsed them out contiguously vis-a-vis each other. And so you can see here's a community trying to, in a contemporary sense, express its territoriality through this kind of map, and through that, bringing out these kinds of principles. These are our laws. These are our stories. This is our first ancestor story. This is the story of the transformation of our relatives that happened here. here are our economic practices that have, in some cases, when people are unwelcome, people from far away, people who aren't recognized here, these are exclusive to us. And so there would be consequences for trespass and some of these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So territoriality has, it's not a complete other, it's not a completely different kind of notion than what we're thinking of in the state context. But of course, it takes on dimensions that are rooted in Indigenous sociality.
Yeah.
So in my study of Coast Salish land tenure principles, which is standing on the shoulders of many other generations of anthropologists and elders who have spoken about why land is important and what is the basis of where our people are making their claims, what kind of maps shall we make. I recognize that there are at least two really important elements to Coast Salish territoriality.
Yeah.
One is the dimension of family relationships, kin connections to properties and areas that are really owned and used by particular families or particular networks of kin. And that if you're not part of that family or you're not part of that network of kin, you may not get the ritual knowledge required or the technical or particular environmental knowledge required to be able to harvest at that area or do some sort of cultural practice that's known by that family. Even locations sometimes can be kept secret. And those places would be defended. There was a place, in the Cowichan watershed that was owned by a particular family for hunting. If you trespassed, you could have mortal consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So there's family properties, but there's also the areas that are owned and from which the laws of the community, what I call the local group,
yes,
the village or the collection of villages, the collection of named houses that live proximate to each other, that is in their control. So here we might have, on a small kind of scale, sort of the beach in front of the village at Penelkut Spit. This is not one particular family's beach, but it certainly is the property of the Penelkut people as a collective, as a local group. Watersheds take on that characteristic as well. And so I think you have this kind of dual system of ownership of land and of jurisdiction over decision making about the whole range of things that happen on those lands that go to both where you live and which family you're a part of. So it's the kind of two sides of the coin, as the famous late Wayne Suttles, another anthropologist, suggested for Coast Salish peoples. So we have this kind of property system that is reflected in territoriality. So that territoriality then goes to the questions of governance, and it goes to questions of ownership. This kind of those two big principles clearly apply here as they do elsewhere in other people's territories. Yeah.
Thank you for this fantastic illustration of the complexity of the territoriality of First Nation. Brian, as you said in your thesis, if you don't mind, we could speak now about the concept of borders, but maybe not the modern concept of borders, because as you have said, is not accurate for analyzing the territorialities of First Nations. But as you said in your thesis, you said you wrote notions of boundaries and are clearly rooted in the diversity of cultural concepts. If Indigenous people have territories of their own, what are the type of borders of these territories? Are there precise spatial limits? As you said just before, maybe they could be more relational or interpersonal relationships, or maybe there are also legal tradition of sharing zone, as you spoke about this beach. which is a common property of the people, or maybe all together. How could we think the concept or the notion of the regime of borders for Indigenous people territorialities?
This is such a great question, and such a foundational question, and it's one that that I think is really important to think through and has consequences. But I want to say at the outset that I recognize that this defining these things is not necessarily the role of the anthropologist to say what it really is. And I recognize that Indigenous leaders have been making clear articulations about what their territories are, where their boundaries are, what those borders look like and what they mean. And I think we do well to heed that, those declarations in all their complexities, in all of their relationship to both Indigenous law and state law. So when I speak, I'm going to speak not with the attempt to kind of undermine or say that when we see a land claims map that it isn't really what it is, because I think that those maps with their simple polygon to define a kind of spatial limit are in many cases leadership's best efforts to put some kind of framework around what is the lived experience and practice of the communities. And I think that so to get into it, and again, I'm not going to speak about all Indigenous peoples worldwide. I can only speak about the communities that I have my own experience with in Coast Salish territories. And there are definitely places in Coast Salish territories that are boundary markers, so that are clearly known by communities as being a kind of post on the beach, or large boulder along the river, which people know. On the other side of that border, it's that community. On this side of that landmark, it's this community or these families. So we can often hear these things. We can often also hear elders talking about an idea that I think goes to a kind of a geographer's tendencies to map watersheds. I've heard elders talk about going up to a mountain that has a good view, and having their territories explained to them by seeing the areas that can be seen from that particular point of view, in this direction, in that direction, these kinds of landscapes of watersheds, that all of those lands contained within that area, are in the territory of a particular First Nation. But within that overall framework of there being markers of points of mutual recognition, and also I think markers of understanding of some limits of who the community is. So if the wars that happened on Vancouver Island in say prior to the 1850s between the Lake-Wilthock communities and around the Campbell River areas and the Coast Salish communities around Duncan, Victoria, Ladysmith, these were the famous wars that ended in the Battle of Maple Bay sometime in the 1850s. It was clear the Lake-Wilthock peoples were not the welcome guests and relatives and friends of the couch, and when they came on their boats to raid and make war, right? So there's a sense that there's not an open commons, but the sense of exclusivity to these territories, to amongst the related communities. But who are in those relationships, and what is the nation, and where do those lines draw? And I think this is where we get into trouble, where we're trying to translate the kind of political structures onto a territory that is rooted in both where you live and which family you're from. So So when we are trying to delineate those borders, and we think, well, it might be straightforward for us to draw a boundary around the Cowichan Valley watershed and say, well, that's just Cowichan, that's Cowichan territory. Well, first of all, the Cowichan would be the first to say, well, we don't only go in the Cowichan watershed, right? And they'll start to, the first thing you'll hear is all the places that Cowichan people have gone. Some of those places are places that they own through family connections, through relationships to people, through marriage, through reparations after war. In one case I can think of in particular, places that are established permanent villages that are outside of these kinds of watershed boundaries, that are in other places on the Fraser River, up the Johnson Strait, or into the Strait of Georgia, or out Wandafuga. Like, so people aren't contained that way. And likewise, families from other communities are recognized as having places in the Cowichan Valley.
Yes.
So these kinds of attempts to draw those lines to make territoriality recognizable to the state have these consequences of excluding these kinds of mutual relationships that are held through family connections, usually, but also sometimes mutual connections that are held with neighboring local groups. So if we take the mouth of the Chemainus River, for instance, let's go one watershed north up to Crofton. And we can see there, if we look at the Indian reserves that were established by the Reserve Commission in the 1800s, there's reserves from the Penelakut Nation at Sussy, Halelt at Westholme. We have two different reserves of the Staminas First Nation from Ladysmith, all right there at the mouth of the Chemainus River. What's going on? Whose territory is this? Which exclusive, nation territory are we talking about here? And those are hard questions. These places are, just several hundred meters from each other.
Yeah.
And yet our kind of state cartographies might demand that we create a kind of like exclusive bubble around that. So I do think that there are some areas where there's a sense of shared exclusivity, where those communities that are so tightly related, both geographically and through family, that they're impossible to unravel, have a kind of shared exclusivity, even though politically, as polities, they recognize themselves as independent, independent nations with independent decision making. And so then we get into really interesting elements of Indigenous legal orders around, okay, well then if we need to make a decision about, commercial shellfish harvesting at the mouth of the Chemainus River, well, what are we going to do? Who's going to make that decision? How do we have a system of governance that isn't just that doesn't fall into the kind of trap of Western thinking, saying, well, if it's not one governance exclusive jurisdiction, it can't be any of them, so it must be a commons or something like that, right? So then there are these kinds of relational governance mechanisms that are rooted in communities. There's big ideas in Hul'qumi'num language, ideas like Natsamat, that are debated and understood in subtle ways in those communities. And again, I think when you were asking me earlier, like, why is anthropology interested in these kinds of questions? Why is it helpful? Right? It's then we start getting into those kind of conversations about the meaning of things and how those things are meaningfully practiced, sort of those, both at the sort of, notion, the level of the notion and the level of the practice and their interplay. That's where anthropology's methodology works pretty well. So we try to help in describing that and sorting that out.
Thank you, Brian, for all these wonderful examples of the richness of territorialities and the forms of territorialities, but also the complexity and also the depth, and so all these important elements. Moving on the next question, if you don't mind, let's now talk about the role of the networks in this territoriality of indigenous people. You spoke about that with marriages, but if we could speak a little bit more about the importance of this network, what is the impact of the family networks, political networks between First Nation and the territoriality of First Nation? Of course, they are constitutive elements of their territories and of their governance systems. But how is this plurality of networks articulated and organized or maybe regulated?
There's so many different kinds of networks.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, this is part of the issue right off the start. There are networks of kin, and in communities that are primarily exogamous, right, where you marry outside of your village.
Yes.
Those networks of kin transcend local space, geographies.
Yeah.
And practices of property, then, particularly with respect to those family properties and those decision makings around family properties, they get quite imbricated with the complexity of those networks of kin. So it's really important to know who you are and where you're from, and where all of the different elements of where you're from through your family tree to be able to activate many different possibilities in your life. It's a great strategy for success for knowing your family tree back 7 generations, because you have lots of opportunities then to say, well, I'm part of this family. Maybe I'll live here for a few years and take advantage of some opportunities that come from that. So in a kind of a positive way, I think that there's this idiom of sharing, this kind of idiom of mutual recognition through those kinds of networks of kin. But there are lots of other networks in Coast Salish political life. There are, of course, networks related through cultural practices like the Big House, where families individuals travel in the winter to participate in different ceremonies, and those practices related to Siawan or the Big House don't, I think, have the same kind of, although those networks are extremely important and foundational in people's lives, they don't take on the same kind of political sense in terms of territoriality. Even though you might have somebody who is initiated in the Longhouse in Duncan and takes place over the course of their lives and ceremonies in many different Coast Salish communities, they're still from a particular place.
Yes.
But that where their Longhouse family is from may not be where their family is from, and may not even be where they were raised. So there, that idea of a Longhouse family takes on that kind of kin network dimension as well. It's very interesting. And then another network that comes to mind, of course, are political networks of working together through a common cause. We can see these networks going back in time in the historical record. I think about that Maple Bay example again of the great battle that the Coast Salish had in the 1850s that ended the wars with the Leopoldtalk. The Coast Salish leaders who were good at war, were good at defending and their communities, they aggregated together people led by individuals from the Duncan area, brought together people from Puget Sound, from the Olympic Peninsula, from up the Fraser River, from down here in Victoria, and on the north part of the northern part of Coast Salish territories on the island, all in this coordinated effort around the defense of their territories. So we can have these kinds of political aggregations, but they, that political aggregation lasted for as long as it needed to.
Yes.
And then, it didn't need to last any longer than that, and people went back to their local communities. And I think today we can see some of those political networks operating in a similar way. Coast Salish communities coalesce. They'll work together under, like let's go to the Fraser Valley. We can think about the Stalo people, the people of the river. There have been any number of different configurations of independent First Nations and tribal councils and treaty negotiation bodies that have all or some or half or a few of the body of Stalo people being members as a part of that political network. And so these political networks are incredibly important today in governance. They're these aggregated political bodies or these independent political bodies. They are the ones that are exercising the law, the rights and title, right? They're the ones working on the issues related to defending their territories from unwanted development or coordinating efforts to see the economic benefit from their territories in a modern sense. But they're not frozen in time. And that rubs up against the kind of modern political imagination of a kind of static nation state. Right. So how can it be that the Stalo are one, and then there are three, and then there are 9 different nations who are all Stalo? Why isn't it just one aggregate thing? The Western imagination wants to ask. But this is the sort of reality, I think, of political life and the reality of the exercise of territorial dimensions of sovereignty, that it's not fixed in a kind of Western imaginary of what Indigenous aggregated politics ought to look like. It's rooted in actual practice of a dynamic system of relationships between political actors and their communities. And I think that's been one of the great struggles of things like overlapping land claims discourses and struggles around resolving treaty negotiations, is that building in that dynamism for communities to make decisions about whether they're going to act alone or together, and to have that be flexible over time to meet the needs of the communities is a challenge in a Western system that is demanding these kind of more simple, less dynamic organization principles.
Thank you, Brian Thom, for this presentation of the importance and the complexity of the networks and the different networks within and between Indigenous people. You spoke about that a little bit. Colonialism exported the industrial production of geometric lines, abstract and artificial lines, which divided the geographical space. What could you tell us about this mismatch between this process of delineation, this process of lines, and the complex relationship of Indigenous people with their own places, as you said, their living environment and between First Nations and Indigenous peoples? The lines is not a common thing in the non-Western imagination.
Mm-hmm. Again, I just want to start by saying that I know that many Indigenous communities have decided on a line, and they're quite satisfied with that line, and they understand and have had the internal debates around where that line ought to be. Yeah. And sometimes they've worked with their neighbors and have had scenarios of mutual agreement around those lines. So I wouldn't want to say that, well, Indigenous people somehow can't have conventional boundaries, because sometimes they can and do.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's the reality. Yeah. But at other times, I think that this simple polygon, this simple contiguous form that we ask to do so many things, that we ask to represent territories and spaces of the exercise of rights, of title, of economic benefit, and especially of jurisdiction and decision making. Those simple single polygons are asked to do too much, And I think I drew a map in my Paradox of Boundaries paper, which I called the impossible map. It's this idealized map of Coast Salish territories that looks like a perfect puzzle piece with many, many, many intricate little, figures decided on by watershed boundaries and island sheds, and attending to kind of local histories and a kind of moment in time, a kind of anthropological moment in time in the early 20th century. But the reality of that map really is that if you look at the contemporary maps in the BC Treaty process, for instance, that there's an enormous amount of overlap of the, when people draw their polygons, they take a different kind of shape because there's all kinds of different things that those polygons are being asked to do, and they're throwing it all in to one boundary.
Yeah.
And so I think I've been challenged to think about what might we do to get away from this idea of the polygon as the way we delimit and recognize Indigenous territories. And it's not a simple question. And I proposed that we draw on an interesting map that the anthropologist Homer Barnett made in the 1950s. When he was working in Coast Salish communities, he said, it's really hard to draw the map that my doctoral supervisor is asking me to draw. He was one of Alfred Kroeber's students, who was in turn a student of Franz Boas, and they all wanted the tribal territory map. And so he drew this sort of idealized, simplistic map rooted on Southeast Vancouver Island and going to the BC mainland, where each of the village communities had radiating lines coming out from it to the places that people that he talked to in his brief visits to each of these communities used and occupied in some way or another. So it wasn't a comprehensive attempt on his part, but you can imagine this map with villages where people are living and these radiating arcs coming out from those villages, attaching to those different places. And I thought, well, could we do that through a more comprehensive approach where we really, we drew on hundreds or thousands of interviews and conversations with people about their places and the places of significance, the places of which they have territorial relations, whether these are sacred sites or land use and occupancy, fishing sites, all these different kinds of places. And then draw those out in relation to where people live and where they go, how they're activating those networks through their family, through their residence, through being invited by somebody else, as a guest, attending to their relationship, and then seeing that over time, so that we're not just looking at a frozen moment at some kind of ethnographic detail, but seeing that over decades, centuries, and seeing how these patterns are dynamic. They shift. They have different consequences as families move and reconstitute and grow and so on as dynamic social life happens. So I tried it out. I tried an experiment, which we hope to publish. We're calling it the Problematic Polygons Experiment. We used DecGL, which is a programming script that Uber uses in order to make the little Uber map on your phone. And then we did a survey of published ethnography. So we just went to the library. We didn't want, it was an experiment. So we didn't want to get into all kinds of, new interviews. And we tried to just go through the published ethnographies and see if we could map those territorial relations between home communities and places of use and occupancy or cultural connection, these kinds of territorial relationships to places. And we built this table of thousands and thousands of records from carefully reading those ethnographies and then created the map. And it's remarkable. The flowers are these bright lines. They look like the jet, the charts at the back of an airplane magazine where they're talking about the terminal cities and where all the jet flights are, but only with thousands and thousands of lines. And you can see, of course, we can color the lines by which communities people are from, for instance. And then you can see, well, the Cowichan people, they're certainly in the Cowichan Valley, but they're also certainly have these places that are further afield. Just like people who are living in, say, Sycamore or Sartlip here on the peninsula also have connections on the peninsula and out in the Gulf Islands. And some of those places on the Gulf Islands are also the similar or the same places as people from Cowichan have. So we can see these places where families that are closely related but from different communities are right side by side each other. So imbricating and entangling those kinds of notions of territories at the places where, on a map in the 1950s, we would have just seen a border, cutting them in half, slicing those communities right in half, where they have an intricate connection in reality. But the polygon demanded a division, an exclusionary division be made. But I'm really worried about this map experiment.
Very interesting.
It's an interesting representation, as incomplete as it is. But I think politically, it's so far from the expectations of what Indigenous communities are asking anthropological maps to do in terms of demonstrating land use and occupancy following the conventional model that has been adopted by the Supreme Court of Canada, that they're kind of dangerous. These maps are could be used by the state to undermine Indigenous communities.
That's a risk, yes.
Yeah, by saying, well, the state law requires you to demonstrate exclusivity, but out here in the Gulf Islands, I can see that these radiating arcs connect together. And since there's no exclusivity in the Gulf Islands, therefore you don't pass the test for title. And if there's no test, if you can't pass the test for titles, you don't have any land rights there, or your rights are merely usufructory, or something like this, which goes completely against the Coast Salish land tenure system. Of course, they have actual land rights there in the Gulf Islands, but the way that those jurisdictions and those connections to those places are, they need to be understood through these kind of idioms of kin, as much as they need to be understood by these kinds of colonial frameworks.
Mr. Thom, we are in British Columbia and the Salish region. We know that this province has passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the DRIPA, in November 2019. Will this new legal tool improve the claims of Indigenous peoples regarding their ancestral and cultural territories? What do you think about the effects of this declaration?
I'm ultimately optimistic about the way that we're adopting this international legal framework into our domestic law. And we're looking then to align our provincial laws in a way that's consistent with the principles of the Declaration. I think it's a non-trivial challenge. Like I feel for the provincial bureaucracy that is working through the implications of that, and I think it's not a small task. But I think that there are a number of really important dimensions there that get us away from the old conversations in the 90s of where we're focused on the question of proof that you have a right.
Yes.
Proof that you have a cultural practice that you have a practice that's integral to your distinctive culture. Prove that it has a kind of spatial delineation that is more than just, the barest, most minimal footprint. I think we're all the kinds of conversations that we're having starting in the 90s, in the 2000s, and even recently. I think that a lot of the kinds of conversations around between Indigenous communities and the state around resource development, land development, economic opportunities have borne on this conversation where the Indigenous peoples have to prove that they have something.
Yeah.
And I think that the Declaration reminds us that we're not founded in a world that Europeans discovered, that the sort of doctrine of discovery made this an empty land and that Indigenous peoples have to prove their tiny place in it. but indeed that Indigenous rights, they are here. They have existed here long before the Europeans, and that in our international law and now in our domestic law, we need to recognize though. So we're into this recognition business rather than into the business of improving things.
Yes.
Let's accept that those rights exist. Now let's figure out what practically are we going to do to care for the ancestors. Let's say that, caring for the dead. I always think of that as like a really basic one. This is a core part of Coast Salish territoriality, is the places their ancestors buried are certainly part of their territories. And that a lot of those places are on beautiful waterfront properties that are private land, many of which have been demolished or devastated by development, some of which have been managed to escape the kind of destruction of the backhoe. And so what are we going to do about that? How are we going to align our laws and our decision-making in a way that Coast Salish legal principles, their territorial laws with respect to caring for the ancestors, are recognized and respected, that they're prioritized and resourced, that we're going to be able to know what to do, and that it won't be just desecration after desecration, of provincial bureaucrats playing catch up with after the fact, after the bulldozers have run. And so I'm optimistic that through some good discussions, and this is just one tiny area of jurisdiction. I mean, we can think of the entire framework of everything from child and family law to, resource extractive decision-making, urban development, all of it. All of it needs to be exercised in a way that's consistent with those fundamental rights based on the cultural principles that we kind of talked about earlier. Those cultural principles that are alive and well in spite of the residential school's best attempts, although, of course, also impacted and hobbled by those attempts, right? Communities need, it's not a situation where all things are equal. There's a lot of amelioration that has to happen. So that territorial reassembly is not just going to be these kind of tiny fragments of Crown land being returned to Indigenous communities, jurisdictions, and ownership, but it's also going to be First Nations using the kinds of resources the state needs to bring to the table to help reassemble those territories from private land buybacks, from logging companies and other kind of industrial interests or private interests. But I don't think that Indigenous communities are saying, okay, well, prove that you have a jurisdiction. I do think that they're saying things like, you've been irresponsible in exercising your jurisdiction over the territories. The province has been irresponsible. They've insisted on having exclusive jurisdiction over archaeological sites. But they've been really irresponsible in exercising that jurisdiction. And so we have
that's a good message.
Multiple decades of devastation of those places. And so now Indigenous communities are, saying like, well, our jurisdiction over our territories is going to be the lead jurisdiction here. We're going to be the highest threshold test by which you need to pass if you're going to, take this on, whether it's an environmental standard or standards with respect to, these kinds of issues of caring for the dead and whatnot, salmon-centric systems, these kinds of things that I think can make that difference. Again, when we often look to Indigenous peoples in a kind of idealized way as sort of environmental leaders and those sort of things, but in a practical sense, I think that the implementation of UNDRIP and grounding our future economic and political decision-making on the principles of recognition of those land rights and territories are going to lead us to better outcomes with respect to environmental decisions and social decisions of equity, and I think those Indigenous principles of governance can lead by that very positive example. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian Thom, for this answer. My last question, and it's about this notion, this legal notion of indigenous territorial title. What will be the future in this region of the Salish Sea region and in BC in general when we think about self-determination connecting with this recovery of indigenous territorial titles? Do you have a message of hope or?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Again, these are very interesting questions to be thinking through, and I'm reluctant to think about title without also thinking about jurisdiction. And I think some of the answers that we're going to have, the sort of positive future answers that are practical, that aren't, some sort of what if pie in the sky scenario, what if all the Europeans just got back on boats and went home, kind of, impossible what ifs, but rather ones that are rooted in kind of a practical solution. So I think in terms of indigenous territorial titles, we're going to have land back. First of all, I know we're going to have land. We're going to see increasingly that indigenous communities are going to be the owners of land in their territories as recognized in the conventional property system. But I know that indigenous communities see don't accept, they reject the old land claims language that cede, release, and surrender, or modify and release, where the lands that the state is recognizing they are the owners of is the lands that they own and have jurisdiction over, and all the lands outside of that are the state no longer has any obligations to them. It's an us and them situation. Indigenous leadership has rejected that for a long time. I think the UN DRIP also gives us a framework that says, yes, we can't be demanding that indigenous communities are surrendering the rest of their territories in order to receive some small amount back, some 5% or 10% back. So this is where this idea that we cannot be thinking just about indigenous territorial title, we need to also be thinking about indigenous territorial jurisdictions. Because I think in the practical way,
of course, yeah,
in the cities, in the places where we have maybe not crown grants, but private ownership by corporations of parcels of land, we need to be considering how legal pluralism would work, where even though the indigenous title to those territories may not be recognized in the sort of fee simple title system, that the underlying title, I'm not calling it the allodial title or whatever like this, but the sort of like the title that's similar to the kind of title that is the sovereign title of the crown, which also gives rise to the crown's jurisdictions, also gives rise to indigenous jurisdictions being applied and effective on those lands. So instead of asking indigenous peoples to trade off and to narrow the scope of their laws and their lawmaking to these tiny land claim settlement areas in the Salish Sea, I think we're going to see indigenous sovereignties and indigenous jurisdictions throughout their territories, throughout those areas that are showing up on the maps. And so that those laws are going to apply concurrently with federal and provincial laws. And the lawyers can figure out whether if there's a conflict of laws, whether one law is going to take priority of the other, but it's not going to be an extinguishment of the indigenous jurisdictions. So I think that in the future, that's where the game is headed. I think that the title game, that this business of indigenous law is foundational to what we're getting at in the indigenous title conversation. and that it may not look like property in the kind of conventional land claim sense where we have these sort of fee simple lots in the provincial land registry that are now the settlement lands, but we have the extensiveness and expansiveness of Indigenous jurisdictions over their territories recognized, whether they're the owners of those lands or not.
Brian Thom, a big thank you for all these very important answers. It was an enlightenment. And during this interview, we have been able to see the complexity of the spatialities, of the territorialities, of the borderities, and this complex articulation, and the importance, of course, of the land for Indigenous people, and for sure, the importance of their legal orders and their legal system of governance. And we will see also in the future a more respectful approach, government to government, more equal approach between all these different entities. Indigenous peoples have a profound relation with the land, the water, and all the interlinked ecosystems. That these relations are the basis of their conditions of existence and of their cultural, legal, and political systems. Better understanding this complexity of the existential interrelations of Indigenous peoples means better respecting them. It means also better improving the government-to-government relationships. Maybe a system of co-governance, and also the consolidation of their own sovereignties in all their complexities. Thank you, Brian Thom, for your participation in our podcast.
It's a pleasure. It's so thankful to be here. Thanks, Benjamin.
It was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Today we were with Brian Thom, Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Victoria, BC, Canada. Thank you for your attention and see you soon for the next interview. Bye-bye.